Hello and welcome to Horror Girls Nightmare Emporium. Today we're going to ask people who went to summer camp as a child what was their scariest or creepiest experience. Not safe for work. Please remember to like and subscribe to our channel and check out our community page for more information on how to submit your own scary work, fiction, or real life. Stay scared.
I went to Girl Scout camp when I was around 8 years old, so around 2001. All the counselors were young 20-year-olds. There was a girl in my group who did something to piss off the counselors. I don't remember what, but I know it was minor. It was the middle of summer and super hot, and she was moderately overweight. They made her sit in the sun and wouldn't allow her to have any water as punishment. They were terrible people, made me super afraid of them as a kid. Stayed at a week-long camp in the early 80s. Our cabins were a mix of old, lumber, built in the 40s or 50s, and new, cinder block from the 70s. A series of storms hit one night and my old cabin was shaking like a ship at sea. A camp director banged on our door and told us to grab a sleeping bag, a pillow, a jacket, and our shoes, and we hiked, mostly in the dark, to the rec center basement. Tornado sirens were blaring and we could hear, but not see, trees crashing in the woods around us. We made it and hunkered down through the storms, but that walk was the longest half-mile of my life. I was young, like 11 to 12 years old, and at Girl Scout camp. One night, after lights out, we were told by our counselors to stay in the cabins, latch the doors, get under the beds, and turn out all lights. Some old guy had gotten drunk and trespassed. He had been walking around the property but luckily didn't find any of the campgrounds. Rumors were he had an axe, but I don't think that's true. We were playing soccer and someone shattered my leg and broke it in 8 places. There was no swelling, so they said I was faking it and they wouldn't take me to the hospital. They sent me back to my cabin for the night. I hopped around for a day, but the next night I was in too much pain to sleep, so I limped to the nurse's office, broke in, and took a handful of Benadryl just so I could sleep. That night, a group was doing an overnight in a 3-sided shelter and decided to have a peanut butter fight before bed. One kid fell asleep with peanut butter in his hair and woke up when a skunk walked into the shelter and pulled a piece of his scalp out. The kid punted the skunk out of the shelter, which caused it to spray everyone overnight. So they had to take the kid for rabies shots, so they might as well take me along to get x-rays since they were going anyway. Helen Keller could have pointed out the breaks on my x-rays. My youth group stayed at a campsite for a weekend trip. We were all in the cabin playing card games when someone with a gorilla suit ran by the cabin and started banging on the door. It really freaked everyone out because it was no one in our group. They came back a couple of times until one of the adults confronted the person and they ran away. They never found out who the person was. As a 13-year-old kid, I went out into the woods at like 1 a.m. with a headlamp to pee, just immediately behind my cabin, because I didn't want to walk to the wash house. While I'm peeing, I look forward and see a large bear, just staring at me. Would have pissed myself if not for the fact that I was already peeing. Either way, I just finished my stream while he stared at me, and walked backward back to the cabin. He turned around and walked away, but there was no chance in hell that I would turn my back on a bear and run the other way. My camp counselor thought it'd be a good idea to take her group of 11-year-olds out of the warm cabin we were sleeping in and instead sleep overnight on the outdoor stage they use for camp plays. It must have been 10 degrees out. I was so cold, it was unbearable. I couldn't conserve any body heat. I had a stick for a body and my sleeping bag wasn't made for that type of camping. I remember being tense and scrunched up in a ball. Every movement I made was like dipping my legs in ice. The outside of my sleeping bag was wet and cold from condensation, which made it worse. Eventually, we walked back at 4 a.m. because all the kids couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't creepy, but it was scary to be so cold and tired in the dark. I still remember it. Went on a camping trip. I was one of the first ones out of the bus and had to use the public bathroom. I notice a few daddy long legs on the wall outside the bathroom and think nothing of it. I open the door and am immediately greeted by thousands if not millions of daddy long legs that are covering the bathroom from top to bottom. The bathroom was big as well, like 3 stalls and 3 urinals. That, and coupled with the fact that our camp counselors were sadistic and told us preteens a bunch of scary stories, then jumped out of the woods in the middle of the night screaming with bloody Jason masks. I stayed in my tent most of the time after that. This was the early 90s at a school camp. I got up during the night to go to the camp toilet. It wasn't far away, I could see it from our tent. There wasn't anybody around. On my way back, I spotted a man I didn't recognize shining a torch into the side of the boys' tent to make shadows appear. When he saw me approach, he put his torch away and walked away, but was sort of hovering around the campsite. I thought he was campsite security and that I was going to get into trouble for leaving my tent during the night, and as I was an anxious kid, it kept me up all night. As I couldn't sleep, I noticed for a good hour or so that the guy was still walking around and shining his torch into the side of tents. I could hear him and see the light. In the morning, I was falling asleep at breakfast and my friends were taking the piss about it. One of the teachers noticed and thought I was getting sick, so she came over to ask if I was all right, and I said I had been up all night because of the camp security guard shining his torch into tents. She looked horrified and said, "What, camp security?" and went off to tell one of the male teachers. It turned out that the campsite didn't have security and the police were called out. Some guy who was known to the area for being a sex offender had recently been released from prison and was living in the nearby forest in a tent. During scout camp, I had a tree branch fall on my head. I was under a tree when I heard cracking noises above me. I could tell it wasn't safe, so I attempted to move somewhere safer, and I guess the universe had it out for me because I only made it about 4 feet before the branch landed squarely on my head. Luckily it wasn't that big and was soft from being rotten, so it didn't cause any major damage. Did hurt like heck though and put me in a lot of shock. The camp instructor/director made sure all of us boys took off all our clothes and watched us shower. Very creepy. I was on a canoeing trip. It was a trip that had been done by this camp for 10 to 20 years. Same canoeing portion of a pretty well-known river. Every year on the first day of the canoe trip, kids and staff members would jump off this rock on the edge of the river. It was probably 20 feet up in the air, estimating, but the water was deep. Probably 10 to 12 feet of water. This group of kids asked to make the jump, just as thousands of kids had done before. We tested the jump by having the tallest staff member jump off the cliff. He safely did so, just as always. So then the kids went and did the same. Several kids jumped, came up, and were all fine. Then one kid jumps come up and says, "I think I cut my knee." Everyone laughed, but then this kid said, "No, seriously, come look." There was a giant chunk of the fat around his knee missing. If the injury had been elsewhere, it would be pumping blood out. It could have been much worse, but the kid was fine. He went to the hospital and got 12 or so stitches. He didn't rejoin the trip, but he went back and stayed the 2 weeks at camp. Needless to say, no kid ever jumped off that giant rock again from our camp. I was about 12 and I was at sleepaway camp, and the counselors took us on a hike into the woods for a night. When it came time to go to bed, of course, none of us were actually falling asleep, and we overheard the counselors talking about the police looking for someone. We later learned one of the kids was in the middle of a serious custody battle and that the dad was planning on taking the kid, and that the reason we were in the woods was so that he wouldn't find us at the cabin. No idea if it was actually dangerous, but looking back it definitely is unsettling. We were on this really long canoe trip in northern Ontario. Like deep wilderness. We were on this gorgeous clear lake when we found a secluded beach. It was really beautiful. So we decided to stay there for the night. The whole day and even sitting around the fire that night felt weird. But I couldn't really place my finger on it. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft country music. None of us had a stereo, so I stuck my head out of the tent to see WTF was up. There was a bald guy going through our campsite picking up stuff as he went along. We made eye contact and he put a finger to his lips and made a sh sound. So I hid in my sleeping bag, LOL. I can't remember what he took, but it wasn't much. Turns out there is a pretty significant hermit population in northern Ontario. Went to a Boy Scout summer camp in the mid-late 90s. They had an archery range where we all were learning how to shoot. They were big on safety, but it was the 90s, so. Anyways, everyone shoots, and we are downrange getting our arrows, then we hear someone yell out in the covered shooting area. I look up and see the semi-special needs kid holding an arrow at full draw and let's go. Hits the kid standing 5 feet from me in the arm. It's chaos, everyone's running around and screaming. The kid with an arrow stuck out of him is just standing there in shock. Next year there was no more archery training. Church camp made us burn our panties that were shameful to God, yet kids were doing all kinds of sexual stuff in the woods. At a cadet camp, we had gone out on the lake pulling some whalers, rowing heavy grade boats that fit about 12 people. We were having fun racing each other when our leaders directed us to form a square with the boats at a spot in the water about 100 yards from the shoreline. Then they told us to look in the water in the center of the square. There was the tip of a ship's mast visible just a few feet under the green water. Apparently, a couple of 100 years ago, a big ship crashed and sunk there in shallow water. I don't think anyone died in the sinking, but talk about thalassophobia. There was this huge-ass ship right underneath us, and you could barely see it if you didn't know it was there. Not sure if this counts, but I went to a popular Christian faith-based sports camp for several summers as a kid. When I was 12, one of my cabin counselors turned out to be the most popular/beloved leader at camp. He was inclusive, energetic, and fun. He gave just as much attention to the cool/popular kids as he did to the outcasts. Randomly, he went to the same university as my older brother and my best friend's older sister, so that created a connection with our families. He also happened to be romantically involved at the time with an up-and-coming singer who lived in our hometown. For a couple of years, after we first got to know him at camp, he would visit my family and my friend's family for a long weekend. By this time, I was over the camp. I never enjoyed playing sports, and that's the only thing the camp had to offer. He would give me and my friend a hard time about bailing on camp and not writing him with any reliable frequency. By the time I finished junior high, that relationship had fallen by the wayside. Anyway, about 10 years ago this guy was arrested and convicted of being a serial child abuser. His M.O. make the victims feel special and get close to their families. So far, almost 60 victims have come forward. One sadly committed suicide in 2019. The camp leadership knew pretty much the entire time what was going on and did everything they could to keep the authorities out of it. Apparently, he tried, but I was lucky enough to never be one of his victims. He's currently serving 2 life sentences plus 30 years in prison. I was in a summer camp on an island when I was 13, and we were hanging out at the beach during dawn. All of a sudden a woman came out of nowhere and walked with big steps towards the water. She had been wearing a white cape, which she threw dramatically away. Underneath she was completely naked. When she reached the water she walked into it, despite it being not very warm, until she started to swim. Always straight ahead away from the island until we lost track of her. We stayed for 1,5 more hours, but she never came back, and it was dark and she was naked and her cape was still at the beach. Back then we joked that she was a mermaid, but it later occurred to me that we may have witnessed a suicide. Other scary stuff was me meeting a fox in the middle of the night while going to the toilet, and a girl trying to kill herself and bleeding all over the place. If the trip to the campsite counts, we also had 2 boys being killed by a truck that fell on them. I went to a lot of summer camps, by the way. Edit, okay, I maybe should also tell the story about the 2 boys, since that actually traumatized me more. I would always drive with the same organization from age 7 to 18, since I was 16 as a supervisor. Because of that, it's also not surprising that so much stuff happened, I guess. We would always drive together as a group in buses to get to different campsites. Now this campsite was in Hungary and I'm from Germany, so it was a really long ride and we drove overnight. Around 1 in the morning we made a stop at a gas station on the highway. I was 11 years old and back together with my summer camp friends and very awake. We went to the toilet and the shop in the gas station and were giggly and happy. I remember that we heard a very loud sound, like a big metal bar falling down. I even remember laughing about it for some reason. We went back to the bus thinking nothing about it. After half an hour of nothing happening, we started to realize something was wrong. A story would go around about a truck falling on a boy and that he came out of a little wood that separated the highway from the gas station full of blood. Also, 2 other boys were missing. I knew one of them from earlier camps. We were not allowed to leave the bus. An ambulance was actually called. I think we waited there till early in the morning, 5 to 6 o'clock. The police was there and everything, and we saw them working from the bus. Then the boy came back, not one of the 2 missing but the one that said a truck fell on him. He had been in the hospital to get stitches and now he wanted to continue the drive. He indeed was full of blood. They drove us to a community center then, and when we got there we all were gathered and told that the 2 boys indeed were dead. They got too close to the highway behind the woods, and just at that moment a truck that transported car parts lost control and fell on them. They got us people there for psychological support, and we had a place to sleep, and they put on movies, etc. It was weird. It was in the news, etc., and I remember informing my parents that me and my brother were alive and well. We actually drove to Hungary after a day at the community center, because most children still wanted to go, even the cousin of the boy that died and the boy that survived, and some children literally couldn't go anywhere else. If you didn't want to go, you also had the opportunity to drive back home. I went, and it was actually a good summer camp because all the people there were going through the same thing. We had psychologists on the campsite. Writing this, I realized that it still traumatized me more than I thought. During the summers, I would spend a month or so visiting family in Michigan. Some of my cousins my age would go to a camp in the Up called Hiawatha. The cabins we got assigned for the week had about 6 campers and 2 counselors, and we were spaced far apart from each other, deep in the woods away from in the common area. There were stories about a father and son that were hunting near the campgrounds during the off-season. The story went that the father thought he saw a big buck and took a shot at it, only to get to the deer and find out he shot his son in the neck. Being so deep in the woods and such a fatal shot, he shot his son in the head to stop the pain. The game and wildlife agents that found them said the father suffered an apparent gunshot wound through the roof of his mouth out of his head in what looked like a murder/suicide. The counselors always felt it necessary to tell this story to the younger/new campers. Now, I don't know if hearing the story and the atmosphere of cabins being so far from the common areas and deep in the woods caused me to see things. But a friend I was walking from the cabins to the mess hall with early one morning, before the breakfast bell, we saw what looked like a father and son dressed like they were hunting, carrying shotguns, walking towards our cabin. Ours was almost second from being the farthest from anything. We took off so fast, sprinting through the trees, and once we hit the open field between the cabins and the mess hall, we saw another group of guys running out behind us. We were shocked to see anyone else before the bell rang, and running no less. We asked why they were running too. They looked back from the direction they came, turned back to us, and said, "We saw a hunter pointing a shotgun at us." Every year I've went to the same camp, and every year they tell us 3 things: watch out for banana spiders, don't have sex, don't attempt to dive down into the lake. The lake in question has many caves at the bottom of it, probably 50 feet to 100 feet down. They used to teach scuba diving but haven't since a counselor drowned. Nobody has scuba dived in that lake or attempted to reach the bottom for 15 years. The stories are passed on from counselor to counselor, and all is relatively the same. A group of kids didn't see their counselor, searched for him, came back up when oxygen got low, and alerted another counselor. Counselors went in the water to look for him, and people checked every inch of this camp in the middle of the woods. People were praying he wasn't in the water and somehow got out. 3 hours later his body was found and taken from the water. He was 22 years old and gone just like that. Edit. I rechecked the article that goes more in-depth with his death, and he blacked out mid-dive, and his friends/students went diving down to help him but couldn't see him. Then when the oxygen got low they had no choice but to go up. Paramedics later pulled his body up. R.I.P. Jacob Fowler, June 27, 2011. The camp nurse, a very gorgeous man named Crush, his camp name Lamau, kept hanging around my cabin group. He would hang out with us every day, and everyone except me absolutely loved him and flirted with him all the time. But there was something creepy and annoying about the way he was hanging around so much. I was the only one who saw that as creepy, I think. He came with us swimming, and I specifically remember him checking out a girl in my group. I noticed and he noticed, I noticed. And then I asked if he was a frat boy because he seemed like the type. After that, I think he was always a little scared of me and didn't bother trying to flirt with me because he knew that I knew he was being weird, flirting with some 16-15-year-olds like that. He wasn't gonna mess with me. And yeah, he was handsome and we were all 15 to 16, I can't blame the girls for thinking he's cute. But still, boundaries. And he had a responsibility to set them when he knew a bunch of teen girls were into him. But he didn't. Literally, only me and the cabin counselor thought it was weird that he was hanging out with us so much. He actually came on a hike with us just to flirt with everyone. I'm not kidding. And at one point, all the girls pretended to be sick so they could go see him in the nurse's office. But you know, guys with attitude always annoy me, so even though I'm 19 now, I think I would still be just as annoyed by him now, lol. I think actually he avoided me because he knew I saw right through him and his handsome face. The other girls didn't think it was a big deal though. Am I finally early enough to one of these posts? When I was in middle school, probably around 2007 to 8, I went camping with my middle school class at a lake on Vancouver Island, BC. The first thing I remember about the lake is how weird and flat the mountains surrounding it looked. For the entire 3 days we were there, everyone was remarking on how much they looked like cardboard cutouts. Now I don't think that this is anything paranormal, probably just something to do with the way the sun reflected off the lake onto the trees or something, but it did kind of give the area a bit of ethereal feel to it. It was an incredible trip. We got to sleep in a teepee, do nature hikes, cook over a fire, all that fun stuff. The weird experience happened on our last night there. It was the middle of the night and I was asleep in a teepee with maybe a dozen other girls when I woke up to an incredibly loud noise. It sounded so cartoonishly alien. A low, pulsing, wowing 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 sound with a loud sound like someone vigorously shaking a thunder sheet in the background. The sounds were so loud, like being right in front of a speaker at a concert. You could feel it through the dirt floor. It should have woken everyone up, but when I looked around no one else had their heads up. I eventually put my head back down and fell asleep with the noise still going. In the morning I asked if anyone else had heard anything weird in the night, and only one other girl in the tent had heard it. She described the exact same sounds. I actually reached out to her a few months ago asking if she remembered the incident, and she did. We've grown pretty distant over the years, so we didn't end up discussing it further. The weirdest thing to me is that at that point in my life I was obsessed with everything paranormal/occult. Not only that, but I was and am a notoriously light sleeper, especially when I'm not in my own room. I can't for the life of me figure out why I didn't go out to look, and how the hell I managed to fall back asleep. To this day it's the one experience I have absolutely zero explanation for. Not at camp. Talking to my friend who says she has to review counselor resumes. I joke, me to screen out the pedophiles? Her, deadpan conversational matter of fact, no, you look for pedophiles in the support staff, the cooks and janitors and stuff. When I was 14, turning 15, I went to the confirmation camp. This place was located middle of literally nothing, just endless forest around us. There was a total of maybe 30 of us, teenagers like me and the camp leaders. The cottage was 2 floors high, and on the second floor were the girls' bedrooms. We were settled down to sleep. It was probably around midnight when suddenly there was a really loud banging on the only window the room had. Since it was already dark outside at this time, you really couldn't see what, or rather WHO was it, until the person turned a flashlight on. The light was going through the room and we were able to see 2 grown-up men, probably aged around 30 years, lurking on us and smiling. Thanks to the one who built this place, the window could not be opened and wouldn't fit a person through it. The leaders of course heard the screams and voices and called the police, but the men had enough time to escape before the authorities made it there. In the morning, while discussing the events of the past night, it turned out that one of the girls in the camp was actually having some kind of relationship with one of these men, yes, illegal much, and had invited them. The police did go and have a chat with these men, but they never got anything of it since they didn't do anything illegal enough. It was still very creepy to wake up to grown-up random men looking at young girls while they were sleeping. On the second floor, there was a fire escape under the window. Went to the same camp for about 12 years. Eventually became a counselor and had a cabin of 8-year-olds for 1 week. All my kids were homesick. They cried frequently. You get to know what your kids sound like? One night I woke up crying but for some reason froze in my bed. didn't recognize the cry, and my gut instinct was to not roll over. It sounded too close to me to be coming from any of the bunks. Eventually fell back asleep and was talking to the counselor from the cabin next door in the morning. She had the same experience the night before. She could not will herself to roll over and didn't recognize the cry. It's most likely we had two different kids crying, and my kid was just oddly standing over my bunk or something. But the experience never really left my head low. I have a few spooky stories from my camp. Most people from my camp have at least one. Went to a day camp and was picked on continually. One day so bad that one kid tried to drown me. Had my mom pick me up and ask not to go back. Being the fat kid sucks. Edit, thank you so much for the positive response. When I wrote it, I was a little depressed. I guess that's why I shared it. Wow, and a real reward, that's never happened. Trigger warning, self-harm. When I was about 10, I went to a summer church camp. There was this girl in my cabin, let's call her Miranda. Miranda was kinda weird, but in an edgy way that Goody Two-Shoes me was intrigued by. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be her friend or if I was scared of her. Cut to one night when I haven't fallen asleep yet, I decide to walk to the bathrooms hoping that a quick walk will help me fall asleep. I get in the bathroom and I hear my counselor and Miranda talking in hushed tones. My counselor seems stressed, and Miranda is crying. So like any good Christian kid at church camp, I stay quiet and listen in so I can know how to be praying for Miranda/S. Turns out Miranda was suicidal and snuck off to cut. And that's the day I learned about self-harm and that Jesus isn't a magical happy pill. It doesn't seem too creepy as an adult, just tragic, but as a kid that was one of the moments that shattered my idyllic sense of the world. Summer camp in Florida, the sheer amount of alligators we had to deal with. The camp had an alligator alarm to warn campers to stay inside/get inside immediately. I was a counselor at a summer camp up in the mountains of South Carolina a couple of summers back. It was me and 3 girls driving up the side of this mountainway late at night. We're idly chatting, I'm in the front passenger seat, and we go around this rightward curve when we see this big black mass in the middle of the right line of the road. We clip this big-ass thing as we swerve to avoid it. It turns out this thing is a big-ass black bear, and we just hit its butt with our car. We drive on, not wanting to further encounter this probably pissed-off bear, and pull off a mile up the road because the girl driving wants to see if her car was busted up. I volunteer to go out because I'm high on adrenaline and don't want to be labeled as a pussy by the guy counselors, and as luck would have it, there's literally no damage to the car in any way. So, with that information now clear and the ever-present memory of having watched Grizzly Man also being very clear in my head, I jump back in the car and we proceed to get the hell out of Dodge. Looking back, a very awesome summer. When I was 13, I went to a summer camp in northern Scotland. When we were there, I absolutely loved it, it was amazing. On the 14th night, I was there, however, I started to notice that something kept moving past the window during the night. The few previous nights I had noticed it but just kind of brushed it off as it was always around 2 a.m. and I was tired. This night was different. I was sitting on my phone for about 4 hours just watching YouTube when I saw the thing move past the window again. Initially, like always, I just brushed it off and left it when I realized that the shape moving past the window had actually stopped in the window as if it had seen me or something. I had no idea what to even rationalize it with, I was just frozen with fear. My best friend at the time, Logan, was in the bunk underneath me, and my older brother, John, in the bunk across, so I woke them and told them the story of this weird figure. Halfway through telling it, I looked at the window again and could distinctly see 2 eyes staring at Logan. I kept my cool and said quietly to Logan and John, "Don't look now, but that thing I'm telling you about is now staring at you." Logan instantly jumped and turned to look at the window when we saw it had moved closer to the window. We all screamed and jumped back into bed when we saw John get up to try and go outside and see what this thing was. Logan was adamant that this thing was some sort of unholy creature sent by the devil. He was a diehard Christian, and I just didn't want to go outside. After the figure did not move for another 15 minutes, we all decided just to go outside and confront this thing. We slowly edged our way out the door and around the side of the building where the window was when we started to hear what sounded like human breathing. Logan and I looked for a large stone and stick respectively so we could protect ourselves. All three of us jumped around the corner at the same time to confront this creature when we saw it, on all fours, run away. It left behind a horrible smell and what looked like a large piece of skin. Went on a river trip with a teenage youth group from church. Got third-degree sunburns and had to stay in my tent most of the trip. The following year they changed it up and did a houseboat trip. I decided not to go and later found out that kids were jumping off the roof of the houseboat into the water. After a few minutes of this, one of the counselors noticed one of the kids was missing. They called Lake Patrol, and some divers found him impaled on a dead tree branch that was just below the water. The woods have eyes. I was about 10 years old. I went to a summer camp in Oregon named Camp Howard. This was the summer of 1994. The camp is a Catholic youth camp but really feels more like every traditional summer camp you might see in movies. Sneaking out in the middle of the night to go skinny dipping, over-the-top campfire horror stories, and all manner of activities, was a blast. This story concerned said late-night skinny dipping. 4 of us boys really hit it off. Nothing erotic, just as a disclaimer here, just that we all had similar thoughts and comfort about being nude around one another. Our cabin was near the old pool, dating back to World War II. It was concrete, old, and mostly still in moving water. They had a proper lake, but none of us felt comfortable walking that far in the dark. They also had a brand new swimming pool, but that was fenced off and had a security buoy that would screech if something disturbed it too much. It was about 2 weeks into my stay. Howard offered longer blocks back then, when my new camp besties decided some midnight skinny dipping was in order. For the purposes of the story, I'm going to name them Sean, John, and Eric. Sean was like me in both looks and attitude. Both loved pretty much the exact same things. John and Eric were quite friendly and open-minded, but our interests were a bit off outside of swimming without clothing. John loved country music, horseback riding, and model building. I'm not, and Eric was into hardcore gangsta rap, basketball, and DC Comics. I'm not. Sean could have been my brother. Both of us were raised in very nurturing and progressive families. We both loved the same music, video games, comics, books, the work. And both of us had discovered we were gay at an early age, so there was also that going for us. The 4 of us snuck out like ninjas in the night. I was skinny as a rail back then, and quite adept at sneaking, and my eyes have always been exceptional in anything other than total darkness. Meaning no light particles at all. So, I didn't really need a flashlight, though we took one just to be safe. Our plan was to go, strip, swim, then get out and walk the trails just a little in the buff to air dry, then return to our beds unnoticed. We made it to the pool, undetected. We chucked our clothes and began to swim. Sean and I sat next to one another and we were talking about boys we liked back home. Eric and John were in the middle of a who can hold their breath the longest contest. Sean was telling me about this boy in class he was sweet but was too afraid to ask him out or anything. I said we're still 10, let's worry about dating in high school. He agreed, worried that there might be some law or something he'd be breaking anyway. It was very shortly afterward that Sean put his hand on my chest, hard. I want to restate that this wasn't a romantic advance, it's that oh my god kind of slap to the chest. Much like a parent would prevent someone from walking into danger. What? Oh my god. Someone's out there. Sean shivered. Note, the water was cold, but not freezing. It was still around 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside, so I figured if I wasn't shivering then everyone else should be fine, right? Where? I asked. Sean pointed and even grabbed my chin to point me in that direction. He was right. Even in the dark, at around say the 6 foot to 6.5 foot height were a pair of eyes and a shadowy shape of a man. The eyes behaved much like a cat's when it reflects light, that animal-like yellow-green in the dark, yet it was at the height of a man. Sean and I whisper to John and Eric to get over to us. They do, and we show them the shadow. John damn near screamed, but just did that sudden squeak and slapped his hands over his mouth. Eric uttered an obscenity and wondered if it was a counselor on night patrol. We asked, why wouldn't they have said anything then? Shine a flashlight, yelled hey you kids. Or something. Eric insinuated something fairly dark, that I won't repeat, but the irony of telling Eric that his argument didn't hold water isn't lost on me. Sean asked what we should do. I said, We grab our clothes and run. We hold hands so nobody gets lost, and we book it. I said I'd take the lead since my night vision is the best. We get close to our cabins, throw our clothes back on, climb back into the cabin and get into bed. They agreed. I counted to 3, and we ran. We grabbed our clothes. I hadn't thought to put our sandals back on, so, let me tell you, running on that trail hurt for days after. We ran, looking over our shoulders. The figure seemed to be following, but still getting further and further away. We made it to the rally point, got dressed, and climbed into the cabin. We slipped back into our bunks, and no one was the wiser. Every now and again, while walking to the campfire, we'd swear we'd catch glimpses of the figure. All summer long, it was this eerie presence. My counselor one night sat the 4 of us down. He noticed a drastic change in our mood/behaviors. We said we'd tell, but we don't want to get in trouble. He said he wouldn't, on the contingent we fess up. We told him the whole thing. We admitted to sneaking out, the skinny dipping, and the shadow figure. At first, he laughed. He told us that he started going to Howard back in the 70s, and sneaking out to skinny dip was practically tradition among young boys, and we shouldn't do it, but he said it was really a no harm no foul instance. His expression darkened, and he confessed that as far back as 1978, the last year he attended as a youth, he also saw the same figure. He told us that he told his counselor roughly the exact same story. He and a much larger group of boys had snuck out for a skinny dip when they also saw the figure. My counselor said that his counselor told roughly the exact same story from when he was a camper there. In the end, we've learned that as far back as the 1960s, this phantom has appeared near the upper pool, very late at night. Summer camp in Florida in 2005. I was a camp counselor and I had the oldest kids that week. The youngest of my kids was probably 12 and he was for sure the weird kid. I knew it when I first met him, and his mom gave me this odd apologetic look when she dropped him off. Anyway, on Thursday night of the Sunday to Saturday week, the kids would be there, and our group was headed off to the showers on the other side of the camp. The kids liked the hike through the dark and it was typically good bonding time. About halfway through the walk, this kid tugs on my backpack pretty hard to get my attention. He whispers in my ear, "We shouldn't go this way." "Why, what's up?" "Oh, we just shouldn't." "Well, the other way takes a lot longer." "I'm not crazy, okay? There's a lady up there and she's telling me to tell you to go back or... Wait, where is she?" I look. "Or we'll die as she did." I stop the group from walking. "How did she die?" "Murder." "Okay, gang. We're gonna go the other way tonight." I still get creeped out thinking about that conversation. One of my first Boy Scout trips was to Camp Nobibo SCO in New Jersey. Nothing particularly bad happened besides the fact of, well, it was kinda the shooting location for the first Friday the 13th. So yeah, that didn't leave my mind all week, and you can imagine my thoughts. Content warning for pedophilia. So when I was in elementary school, grades 1 to 6, I was in Beaver Scouts, which is like the Canadian version of Boy Scouts, in Scouts Canada. Every summer we would go to this lakeside camp decked out with a wharf, log cabins, canoeing, and archery range, the whole shebang. One summer, we were out canoeing, and as we were young children, we all had an adult chaperone, either one of the campers' parents or one of the scout leaders. Just in case something happened or a kid had an allergy attack or etc. At some point, while we were canoeing on the lake, the adult I was with noticed something. One of the other canoes had hit a downed tree, basically an old tree that had fallen over and was slightly underwater. We rush over to help the kid and the adult out of the water and into our canoe and rush back to the shore. They were suffering from hypothermia because even though it was a summer day, we went canoeing in the earlier part of the day, so it was still a bit chilly. We rushed them back to one of the cabins to help them get into dry clothing. I helped the adult back to the men's adult cabin so he could get changed into dry clothing, and then we would escort them to the medical area built into the large dining hall complex. While that guy was getting changed, he handed me something through the cracked door and told him it belonged to the kid he was with in the canoe and that I should return it to him. So I did. I rushed over to one of the boys' cabins and walked in on the adult I was in the canoe with, inappropriately touching the kid and making comments about how the shivering the kid was doing was making his muscles tense and that this was the best way to warm up. He looked up when I opened the door and he yelled at me to leave, and I ran. Later on that night at the dining hall, that adult came up to the table I was sitting at with some friends, and he said that I shouldn't worry about what I saw and that it was just medicine. Then he gave me the creepiest shoulder touch I've ever experienced in my entire life. I told my dad I didn't want to go camping next summer, and when he asked why, I told him what happened and he was furious. I have no idea if anything happened to that guy, but I like to imagine he got in trouble. I have a pretty basic one. When I was 9, my parents sent me to a summer camp in the middle of the forest. The following information is important. The camp was separated into 2 buildings, the dorms for 6 to 10 years old and the other one for the 11 to 16. Thing is, the 11 to 16 group was gone camping far away near a river. The campsite was only occupied by the people from my building. The curfew was at 9. Adults would check if everyone was in the dorms, lock the doors, close the lights, and then stay in the lobby, making sure nobody was trying to sneak out. The 11 to 16 had been gone for 3 days, meaning there was absolutely nobody outside since the supervisors weren't allowed to leave their shift until 1 a.m. At midnight, I wake up because of the heat, about 37 degrees Celsius in my dorm. I start hearing strange noises coming from outside. We had a window with a view on the lake and the forest. I look out the window and notice a group of 6 people, with lanterns and long black dresses. Not your usual flashlight BTW, the one you light with fire. They continue singing and approach the dorms. At first, I thought they were just supervisors messing around or an activity made for the other group, but then I remembered the adults aren't allowed to leave their shift until 1 a.m. and the other group is coming back in 2 days. Pretty creepy. I have no idea who those people were. Eventually, they walk away into the forest, and I never heard of them again. Other children from the dorm saw them too. We told the supervisors, who said they'd look into it. Never heard of them again. Apparently, the year after I stopped going, or so the story goes, a counselor was arrested for kidnapping children and killing them, and the bodies were found pseudo-taxidermied in a cave. I think I was like 8 or 9 at the time, and the legend almost definitely grew to include some fiction, but I know for a fact that a counselor kidnapped some campers and killed them. I went to Penn State football camp in 1997 and was made to do push-ups in my underwear along with dozens of other campers in the middle of the night because some other campers were causing racket. And now take a wild guess who was the coach that made us do it? Yes, it was Jerry Sandusky. The redhead coach was also there. Had a little moment that has made me exponentially more afraid of the dark ever since. Was playing kick the can late at night. I was actually a counselor at this point, and on the final night of camp, all the oldest kids get to stay up really late. I was hiding in wait to run in and, well, kick the can. When I found the weirdest hiding spot ever. It was pitch black out, but there was a series of small, waist-height, light posts running along a path, with a line of pine trees maybe 20 feet away. Somehow, with the way the light and shadows were interacting, I was able to stand in the open by the pine trees but still be completely in the dark, invisible to people standing out in the more well-lit area. The weird part was that I could see them perfectly. Now, whenever I am outside at night and I see little patches of darkness or lines of trees, I think about how anything could be right there just watching, and I wouldn't be able to see it. I went to the camp where they filmed Friday the 13th. When the film wrapped, they gave a decapitated head made of wax to the camp director, who loved to take it out during campfire to scare little old 8 Yomi. Worked. Went to a quite terrible summer camp when I was 7. Like all kids, we would tell each other scary stories at night. This girl tells us a story about a black hand, not of a black person, just a hand colored black that isn't connected to anything, that hides in dark corners and strangles people. Our fantastic educators come in because of the noise we make. 20+ scared little girls generate a lot of noise, and decide to punish her for keeping everyone up at night. The best punishment they could think of was to make the girl to stand in a dark corner of a dark room without any windows. She was gone for maybe 5 minutes when we heard her scream and fall. She didn't return to the room that night or for the rest of the stay. I was adamant that the black hand was real for quite some time after that. The same girl said that the lifeline on my palm was too short and that I'd die at 20, which seriously haunted me until I turned 21. I was in Boy Scouts, and the summer camp we went to had Adirondack cabins, which is just a 3-sided structure that was big enough for 2 bunk beds. It had a roof, a concrete slab for a floor, and enough spiders to make sure you got the average amount in your mouth while you were sleeping for a lifetime. There were maybe a dozen or so, arranged in a ring around each troop's site. One year, I read The Exorcist. Easily the scariest book I've ever read, out in the darkest woods in Ohio, in a structure that only had 3 walls. That's it. I did that to myself every night. Fucking spooky. Not really scary, but definitely creepy. I was in a Boy Scouts troop when I was around 13. Our trips generally consisted of going around camping areas in the South and staying there from Friday to Sunday. One of our trips brought us to a rodeo/ranch where we were able to camp out because the owner was good friends with one of our scout leaders. To give you an idea of the area, it was a fairly large ranch surrounded almost entirely by a forest. One night while we were all around a fire, we noticed 3 lights in the sky hovering over the woods, which slowly multiplied to 6, then 9 lights in a moving pattern. After appearing, they stayed in the sky for around 10 minutes before slowly fading one by one. The group I was with consisted of 5 adults and around 13 teenagers who all witnessed this and started freaking out a bit, which our leader tried to calm by saying they were floating lanterns, which they definitely weren't. Anyway, this was the strangest event that's ever happened to me on a camping trip, and I still think about it today as my UFO sighting. This wasn't scary to me at the time, but as an adult looking back, very scary. When I was 12, I was at this summer camp and the counselors were all in their late teens. The camp kids were mean to me, so I ended up becoming friends with the counselors. And we would all drink and party after dark. Also, towards the end of the camp, went on a boat with them. I do not know WHO was operating the boat, I can't remember, but it was probably one of the teens. But the boat got lost for like half an hour. We ended up back at camp fine, and nobody got in trouble because nobody found out. We all should have got in trouble for that. And I had no business hanging around with older kids and especially drinking. I was overweight at that time, so nothing sexually inappropriate happened, but still, really cringe to look back on it. Makes me uncomfy now. But at the time I was like, I'm so cool, older kids like me. I think the counselors just thought it was funny to party with a little kid. Inappropriate, and the reason my future kids will not be going to summer camp unless I know how the camp is run/know there is supervision. Running into a nest of rattlesnakes on a hike. Like, 4 of them at least. I think the same trip some bears wandered into one of the camps of another troop. No food in tents, kids. Always set up a Bermuda Triangle. The 3 points of the Bermuda Triangle, intended to draw bears and other critters away from where you sleep, are your fire pit, septic drain, and bear bag. Your bear bag should be, 20 to 30 feet off the ground and 100 plus feet from where tents are. Not camp, but it was a friend's paintball trip. 13 kids and 4 adults. The first night we were in the woods camping and started hearing stomping and growls in the woods from all around. The adults had their shotguns out patrolling for the sounds. Went on for hours, scary as fuck. The next morning we found out it was the adults making the sounds to scare us. Well played. During the night, I saw what is called shadow people. I made a post about it with more details if you're interested. What really scared me is that when it happened, I shrugged it off as hallucinations in the dark. But the next morning, before I told anyone about it, someone who was sleeping in my room said that she saw shadow people during the night. So it wasn't hallucinations after all? My family runs a free summer day camp for kids that can't afford the fancy ones, and at the end of it, we usually have a week-long camp out for the student leaders that we had hired. After the student leaders go home, my family usually stays and we do our own thing for a week or so. At this point, it was just our family and it was somewhere new that we'd never camped before, but the whole time things just felt wrong and tense. Some key things that ended up happening were, everyone would argue, Just out of the blue, we'd be screaming at one another for the smallest things. There was just a strange tension in the air, and everyone felt on edge. My sister and cousin floated way out on the lake. Their blow-up boat deflated, and we had to ask someone with a motorboat to save their asses while they almost drowned. My cousin, who was driving a truck, ran right over my brother's tent literally seconds after he stepped out of it. She was in complete shock and swore the truck lost control, waking up in picnic tables that were fine when we went to bed being completely destroyed, hearing weird whisperings and noises at night. Sometimes we all swore it sounded like women and children crying faintly, people randomly feeling ill. Also, once we left and looked through our pictures, we got a fucking scary one of a headless face behind my sister in a selfie that she took. We ended up packing up early, and it was by far the scariest camp trip we ever had. Needless to say, we never went back to that place.
Not leaving us so soon, are you?
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And feel free to leave a comment or email the Horror Girls with suggestions, your own scary experience, original fiction, disconcerting videos, or anything horror related that you would like to share. We'd also love to help promote indie or up-and-coming horror authors by posting a book review or your book trailer. Email us for more info.